Welcome. Welcome to the London School of Economics. My name is Professor Elizabeth Robinson, and I'm Director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. Welcome to the audience and welcome to our speakers who I will introduce you to. This event is between the Honourable Catherine McKenna, who's in conversation with the Right Honourable Chris Skidmore MP. And they're going to talk today and have a conversation about how to carry forward and implement the findings of the United Nations Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero commitments of non-state entities, which was published in November 2022. And the group's report set out a roadmap to prevent net zero from being undermined by false claims, ambiguity, and greenwash. This is an LSE public event in partnership with the Grantham Research Institute, and it's also part of the Institute's 15th anniversary celebrations. So I just want to talk you through the format. It's pretty straightforward, but it's going to be, to start with, we'll have the 45-minute conversation between Catherine McKenna and Chris Skidmore, and that'll be followed by a Q&A with the audience. So I encourage you to post your questions, and then most likely we won't be able to get through all of them, but we'll get through as many as possible. Please post your questions to the Q&A channel and not through the chat. This event is being recorded and it will be available as an audio podcast, hopefully, if we don't have any technical problems, made available to the public after the event, which would be for free and unrestricted download from the LSE website. So before I let Chris and Catherine start their conversation, let me just give you a very brief introduction to the two of them. The Honourable Catherine McKenna was appointed as chair of the high-level expert group on net zero commitments of non-state entities by the United Nations Secretary General in March of 2022. She was Canada's Minister for Environment and Climate Change between 2015 and 2019, and Minister of Infrastructure and Communities between 2019 and 2021. Possibly most important, or possibly not, but certainly particularly nice for us, is that Catherine's also an alumnus of the LSE. So welcome so much to this conversation. Chris Skidmore is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Kingswood. For those of you who don't know where that is, that's close to Bristol. Tell me if I've got it wrong, but I don't think I have. Yeah, good. He was the UK's former Energy and Clean Growth Minister, attending the Cabinet, and he signed the UK's net zero commitment into law in June 2019, which was, for those of us in the UK in particular, a really big event. In September 2022, Chris was appointed chair of the Net Zero Review, which is an independent review into the delivery of the UK net zero climate commitments. And the report of the review, Mission Zero, was published just a couple of months ago in January 2023. So thank you so much for giving up your time, Chris and Catherine, for this conversation. I'm going to step back, mute myself, turn my camera off, and with the audience, we're going to listen to this conversation for about the next 45 minutes before we start with a Q&A. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And Catherine, it's great to see you again. I think we first spoke when we were both energy and climate ministers back in 2019. And I remember having taken over from sort of Claire O'Neill, you and Claire had done a huge amount of work on the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and you were really supportive. I remember having our first conversation, our first bilateral, and I was delighted when you sort of said, very happy to support the UK bid for COP26. And I think that was the first chance we had to have a conversation. But I think we find ourselves in quite similar scenarios now. We're no longer holding ministerial office, but we've both had the experience of taking forwards reports recently. I've obviously published the Mission Zero Net Zero Review, but you've obviously published Integrity Matters for the UN. And I just wondered whether you might be able to sort of say why you've come to London this week and what you're now doing with the report going forwards.
Well, that's great, and really great to be joining you, Chris. And of course, as LSE is my alma mater, lovely to be here. So thanks to Elizabeth, but also my good friend Nick Stern, who I think just got back from London, just got back from India, so that's why he's not here. Well, other than trying to get to the Parliament Hill Lido and go swimming, because I do a lot of swimming, I'm here for a number of reasons. Of course, doing something with LSE, but I was, the FT had a Climate Live event. And the report focused on non-state actors, so business, financial institutions, as well as cities and regions. So talking to business people about what the report says and being clear that there are clear standards and criteria, and you can measure climate action, in particular net zero, is a priority. So doing some meetings around that. I did see Claire O'Neill, so we started Powering Past Coal many moons ago. And I met my friend Bob, who I went to LSE with, and we were talking about Cool Britannia. That's how old I am. Cool Britannia, New Labour. That's when I studied at LSE.
And your report, I read it during the, I think it sort of came out just around COP27, didn't it? So it was at the point when we were doing the Mission Zero consultation phase. And I was really sort of struck by the work you'd done in the report around providing an accurate concept of net zero, because I think too often we're at risk of seeing sort of net zero getting diluted, seeing certain oil and gas companies making net zero commitments, saying they're a net zero company. But you've now set out, I think, a really sort of acceptable definition of what net zero should be and how companies and organizations should set their net zero trajectories. And I don't know if you wanted to sort of, by way of introduction to our discussion around greenwashing, give a sense of what you now see as being properly true net zero.
Well, I mean, so when I was asked by the Secretary General to do this report, I thought, okay, we need to be practical. I'm a very practical person, and I think we need to be also very clear, because business thrives on clarity. And when it's not clear, it's hard for the good businesses who want to do things on climate, but it also makes it easier for folks who want to say they're net zero and actually are not doing the work. So there's only 10 recommendations. So if you want to read the report, it's actually written in pretty clear English. One of the biggest challenges, I think, for those of us who work on climate is we use all this jargon and acronyms and words that regular people don't understand. So essentially, I mean, first of all, if you take it at the highest level, because sometimes say, well, it's really hard to know what to do. You know what we need to do on climate? We need emissions go down drastically now, not 2050, but right now. And we need to scale investment from dirty to clean as quickly as possible right now, too. And you can measure those. And so what we said is, okay, this is what you have to do. So if you're going to be saying you're net zero, putting up your hand, volunteering, saying I'm a leader, you need to be, have a target. We'll have targets, have a long-term target, but as well as short-term targets that are 1.5 degree aligned. You need to have a transition plan. So you need to show what are you going to do right now. And then you need to disclose in a transparent way and be accountable for what you're doing. And we need to have comparable data. I mean, we need to see, okay, what's your baseline emissions? Are your emissions going up or down? We need them to be going down. Where are you spending your money? Also, you need to align executive compensation, because we know, I was the environment minister, Chris, as well as I do, it's great to be in that portfolio, but you need everyone around the table to be supporting you, whether it's transportation or especially finance, basically everyone. And it's the same in a business. So you need your CEO, but as well as your leadership to really be all in. And one of the ways you do that is ensuring that executive compensation is aligned with your goals. What can you not do? So I also thought, and I should say there was a group of 15 other members from around the world, very diverse groups. So it included the former governor of the Bank of China. It included environmentalists, scientists, business leaders, former regulators, whole range of folks from around the world, very, very diverse. And I'm very happy it was gender balanced. That was a condition of mine. And so they came with very different perspectives, but all very practical. But we decided we needed to call out greenwashing, because sometimes you can kind of say you need to do this, and then people aren't, are doing other things that are not consistent. We felt like the Secretary General was very clear, no more greenwashing. So we were just going to deal with the real, the elephants in the room. Number one, you cannot invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure. You cannot put your hand up and say, I am a climate leader while you're investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure. There's already a lot of investments. Fossil fuels, obviously, we need to get out of them, but you can't be investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure. That's what the International Energy Agency has said. That's what the science says. Two, you cannot get to net zero by buying cheap credits, offsets. You need to do the work yourself across your value chain. So in climate language, we call it scope 3 emissions, but you have to actually do the work. That doesn't mean that you can't use credits beyond your net zero pathway. And this sounds pretty nerdy, but it's important. You actually have to reduce your emissions. And that's good because you get innovation. If you're just buying credits, you're not going to go say, oh, okay, how can I innovate in this space? Take EasyJet. EasyJet used to be doing credits. They said they would not do credits on their net zero pathway. Well, that's great, because if they can innovate, if they can figure out low carbon fuels, if they can figure out, lighter planes, if they can figure out, biofuels, like all these things, that will make a huge difference to everyone. They can scale. Three, you cannot lobby against positive climate action. And I know this very well because people would come into my office and, they'd say, yeah, that's great. Then they go to finance and say, don't do any of that. So that is over, but we had a nuance, which I think is important. We also said that you cannot be for example, a management consulting firm who's providing advice. You can't be an accounting firm. You can't be a marketing firm working with folks that are doing lobbying against climate action. And so I think it's really important because we need everyone to be working in a positive way. And then in the end, so our last recommendation is we need to regulate. Governments need to regulate because ultimately you need to have accountability. And the way you do that, there's also free riding. There are folks who do not even have net zero targets, a lot of privately held companies. So it's really important that you get to the space where you say, okay, everyone has to have a net zero plan. They need to have a transition plan and they need to disclose transparently. So that's essentially it. And of course, it sounds like a bit Debbie Downer. One, it's just supposed to provide some discipline to everyone. Like, you know what? You want to say this, this is what you need to do. But it's also this opportunity for an ambition loop. And we talk about that, where we need businesses to be, really leading the way, to be working with government to get ambitious climate policies, because it's damn hard. I was in government and trying to get a carbon price, which we did across the board. We were able to do it because we had a carbon pricing leadership coalition, which was what I called it. And we ended up we started off with 2 banks, and then all 5 banks had to be in. They all had to support it. We had manufacturing companies, we had consumer goods companies, and we had one oil and gas company. And that, as you know, Chris, makes a difference when you actually have business saying, this is good for business, this provides certainty, this creates the right incentive for us to innovate. So that's the plan. The plan is to provide net zero can either be terrible because everyone's talking about 2050. And as my son, my youngest child says, they're all going to be dead by then anyway. And that's hopefully not true. They'll still be alive in 2050. But the reality is our incentives that far out are very hard. It's really about providing the incentives for people to do the work now and call out the greenwashers, but to support the high ambition corporates and financial institutions. It's hard. No one's going to be perfect, but we need to see leaders and we need to celebrate leadership for folks who are actually doing the work to get to net zero.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive overview of what you've done in the report. And I know you're sort of planning a high ambition roundtable with the financial sector in London. I think that's taking place tomorrow. It'd be great to hear about sort of where you think now you can take the report and how to deliver it. I sort of find this myself with the Mission Zero report and the Net Zero View. We picked up on a number of same sort of topics that you did around financial disclosure. I think we called for a net zero charter mark, because I think the challenge, you mentioned regulation, is who holds the reins here. Is it going to be national governments? Is it going to be the work that Rachel Kite's sort of taken forwards around how we can establish a regulated market around sort of carbon markets for the future? I mean, that was something in the Mission Zero report, was looking at net zero and the future and how we can be sort of agile around this. I think one of the things I hadn't heard of, I mean, probably everyone's going to sort of say, oh, I can't believe you didn't hear this, was sort of this word green hushing. And that was a first for me when I sort of went round with the Net Zero Review and held like the 50 round tables. Yeah, there was enormous enthusiasm to act, but also this sort of sense of like not sure which foot to put in front of the other, and and are we going to end up being castigated for taking the wrong action inadvertently if we don't have the framework in place that we know what we need to do now and how to do it. And I think your report really sort of sets out the framework. But who do you think should lead this? How can we make sure that companies feel comfortable that they're not going to have be taken to task in 10 years' time for taking some of the wrong actions by default?
Well, I mean, first of all, no one's going to be perfect in this space. So my analogy is I used to be a competitive swimmer. I still love swimming. But you'd have a long-term goal. It's a stretch goal, right? You're not going to get it in day one. You're going to have to work really hard day in and day out. It's not very glamorous. Sometimes you're going to suck and it's going to be hard. You're going to get demoralized. And other days you're going to make great progress. But the deal is, in a few years, you want to be achieving your goal. And I think that's what this is really about. No one is going to be perfect. So we do have to be careful. And by we, I mean all of us who care about climate action, to not be, slamming folks because they're not perfect. I think really calling out folks who are engaging in greenwashing is really important. But we do need to create the space for folks that are doing the work and trying to figure this out, hopefully as fast as they can. We need to recognize leadership in this space. I think this idea of a net zero mark or something, like you can have sticks, and certainly there are sticks. So for folks out there, whether you're even saying you're net zero or not, if you're a publicly traded company, you're at real risk if you're not taking climate action. Forget about if you're greenwashing. The folks are paying attention now, and so you can end up, there can be litigation against you. There can be action with the Competition Bureau. There's a whole range of different ways. There's going to be some discipline. But we do need to reward people who are doing well. And so maybe if there's some way you can distinguish, because I think we need to distinguish between the groups. Like on one hand, the people are doing nothing, or worst case, they're actually going in the wrong direction. And then there are folks who are working hard. Now, how do you have true accountability? So we talked about this because, we wrestled this a bit in our report. The UN is not a global, overseeing body that can enforce things. And in a way, the greatest power of a Secretary General is his voice. He's been very, very clear about the need for far more action, about the need to call out greenwashing. But there are bodies. So a lot of folks that have signed up for net zero are part of different initiatives, whether it's Race to Zero or of targets through the Science Based Target Initiative, or part of GFANS. There have been some challenges with GFANS with the members actually stepping up. So I think those bodies that actually, have members need to make sure the members are living up to the requirements. That's important. If they aren't, then there should be consequences. There always has to be consequences. I say to my kids, I don't know, there are consequences. If you don't do what you're supposed to be doing, well, you're going to get in trouble. That's the way it is. But I think ultimately, there's steps in between. I think radical transparency is really important. That's actually how the market works as we think about it. You need transparency. And so I think that, the disclosure piece, we've seen the ISSB, there are definitely standards coming out and folks will be required to report. And if you look at Mark Carney, another Canadian, when he started his work on disclosures, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, I remember sitting there and people were like, I don't know what he's talking about. This isn't going to go anywhere. And now it's actually being regulated. So I think it's going to take some time. But ultimately, we need national governments, or, for example, the EU, who has moved into this, who is going to regulate, to actually step up and regulate in this space. Because otherwise, there's a limit to voluntary bodies. There's a limit to voluntary pledges. Now, in good news, Michael Bloomberg with President Macron, and now a whole host of folks are working on a net zero data portal or utility. I can't remember what they called it. They always have less sexy names. Maybe they should be something a little more exciting. But what they're going to do is they're going to actually highlight companies and where they're at. So, but basic information, because I think we need to start and not make it too complicated. What's your baseline? What are your emissions now? How are your emissions going? Are they going up and down every year? Where's your money going? Is it going to dirty or is it going to clean? Do you have a transition plan, like a real transition plan? I think if we started off with that and you had comparable data, that would make a big difference. They're going to do that in conjunction with the UNFCCC. But I think that's going to be important. Why? Because in the absence of regulation, you have people. And this is what I get excited about, because people now care. Why would you, if you're a publicly traded company, put up your hand and say you're going to be net zero? Especially if you're not doing it. Why would you do that? Because you feel public pressure to do it. Because remember, it's voluntary, so you don't have to do it. And so the reality is the public is getting a lot savvier. And so being able to go to a website where you can see how companies are doing, that'll have a real impact. Because one, if you're a consumer and you care about the climate, you can see, oh, okay, how are these folks doing? Are they actually really doing what they say they're doing? And you'll be able to do that. If you're an investor, and by investor, I mean like big investors, like you're investing in these companies, or you're a shareholder. You can decide where to park your money. Your bank, who you're going to bank with. You can see who's doing the best job in the banking sector. If you're often young people, but an employee, you can go see who would you like to work for, like who is really doing the work. If you're a pensioner, you can put pressure on your pension fund and say, heck, I don't want my money, or you're an employee, I don't want my money to go fund, say, new fossil fuel infrastructure. So I think there's like a spectrum that will get us there, but it's going to be messy. Everyone in the climate space, well, often people in the climate space want it to be perfect. You and I were both in government, Chris. It's messy, right? Like it's not going to be perfect. Everything isn't going to be done properly. You're going to have to recalibrate. But what we do need is we need to be focused on the science. And I think that's the most critical, because while there is some progress, we are nowhere near where we need to be. And we need to reduce emissions by half by 2030. So a lot of people are talking about technological innovation. That's great, but emissions need to go down by half globally by 2030. So there is no time. There is no magic bullet. You're just going to have to every day, one foot in front of the other, and everyone's going to have to really dig deep. And I mean, ultimately, as I say, everyone needs to be part of it, which is why you need to regulate. But I have a question for you, because I've talked a lot about my report and what we've said as an expert group. But I mean, you're in a government, and I think, well, you aren't anymore, but you were, and you've done your net zero report, which I really think was great, because in a way you framed it like, how do you achieve net zero while also having positive benefits, which is like jobs, growing your economy. And you talk about it in that space, but maybe why don't you talk to folks? Probably we have a lot of people here from the UK, but also beyond. Like what did you find in terms of government, and what does government need to do, and what's the business case for doing this?
So yeah, I think you're right that when I got the opportunity to do the review, you might remember it was the previous Prime Minister, Liz Truss. I think it lasted about 6 weeks.
No, I was like, which previous Prime Minister? Sometimes it's confusing if you're Canadian. I'm just like, wait a minute, what happened? What happened?
I mean, I think probably the net zero review is the one thing that probably actually came out of the Truss government that actually is here to stay. I have to say, like a rare Edward the VIII coin, the sort of the king in 1936. And basically, the review came out of the politics, and I'm honest with you. So I set up this net zero support group. I could see, and it's interesting, we've been talking about sort of the groups of individuals who want to see climate action. It's how you also take everyone with you, and those people who might be skeptical about climate progress, and they see net zero. I'm increasing culture war, and seeing this as some kind of woke project. I'm a centre-right politician. When I signed net zero into law, I saw it as the bare minimum we could do that would also allow for economic growth. And I understand some people say net zero isn't going too fast, and I totally agree with you. Net zero isn't just about 2050; it's about 2030. And if we don't, as the UK, meet our NDC, 68% emissions reduction, everything starts to unwind, because why would other countries then meet their NDC? So I always think net zero is 2030, rather than 2050. So totally agree with you there. But partly the review was, I was asked, how do you achieve net zero in an affordable, efficient way, one that's pro-business, pro-growth? And I've always felt that there was an enormous opportunity for net zero to be seen as an economic growth tool, as you know, as well as obviously critical for tackling the climate crisis. But I wanted to meet head on a sort of that sort of right sort of challenge that net zero is going to make us poorer and colder, which is a total load of rubbish. And I needed to be able to set out this narrative that it is an economic opportunity if we so wish. And then obviously, since having done we were halfway through the report when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. And I think we've really seen this acceleration now that, we've got other countries, US, Germany, EU, elsewhere around the country now, sort of around the world, saying, actually, these are investable propositions, and we want to place, the future of our economy will be a green economy. So I was really keen to try to tackle that sort of that sense of skepticism. And the interesting thing, you're absolutely right, the science, no one now, I think, really, unless they're absolutely, completely off beam, would say there's not, climate change is happening. But the same people who are sort of saying, oh, it's, there's no problem, are now saying, oh, well, are we going too far, too fast? Do we really need to not, get rid of petrol cars?
That's the new form of greenwashing, where you're like, oh, I believe in climate change, but we shouldn't be doing anything. Or there's a solution's going to come like in 2035 or 40. Yeah,
exactly. And that was for the review, demonstrating if you want to do this in an affordable and efficient way, you've got to get on with the job now. That's the only way you're going to cut the cost of capital, build up the supply chains. Actually, that the investment, if the investment doesn't come now, a 10-year delay will add on well over 20 base points to our debt GDP ratio, and trying to demonstrate that we are, not just there's a moment of opportunity here. I think we said in the review about £1 trillion worth of inward investment potentially to flow into this country by 2030, 480,000 new jobs. I didn't just call them green jobs, but I think the challenge here is it's actually going to benefit the whole of the economy rather than putting the sort of the green economy on a separate on a pedestal. But otherwise, this sense of a crisis that will only continue to worsen, and there's no prize for following. I think the thing is that we're only going to end up finding that other countries would have taken our workforces, they'll have taken companies. I think this is already happening. And we've got the government hopefully going to respond to the net zero review now. I think Grant Shapps, the energy secretary, said end of the month. Our last day of Parliament's the 30th of March. And then
put in your calendar, folks. Put in your calendar.
Yeah.
I'm waiting to see.
And the good thing, obviously, with the UK, I think it's not the case in Canada at the moment. But this is our net zero commitment is in legislation. So the government was taken to the High Court by Client Earth. And the net zero strategy, I had nothing to do with it. I was out of government by this time. I would have done a far more detailed job. Has actually been found to be legally deficient. So the net zero review provides the government with a blueprint, if they so wish to take it, on how to achieve net zero. And so that's been my sort of contribution into government, and I'll wait to see whether they take it up. But it's been an independent review. Although I am a Conservative MP, I don't want this to be seen as
Did you just show us your blue tie? To show is that a thing that you have to wear a blue tie?
You don't have to, but sort of I don't know. I've got
you're just like every day. It's a lot easier if I put my blue tie on.
I'm not really.
I remind myself I'm a conservative. Some days it might be hard, but
well, exactly. So I mean, I didn't vote with the government like earlier this week on the migration bill, but so I'm on the north step.
We could talk a lot about that. We won't.
Well, I nearly became an independent MP. I nearly lost the whip during the Mission Zero coalition because I didn't vote on the government on a confidence vote, which obviously is sort of
that's
really
like
serious.
Very not cool. I like when they say the whip comes down. A lot of my friends, the whip came down and they were out or something. I didn't really understand. You have very weird language here.
Yeah, 3-line whips.
Maurice Stewart, for example, didn't he, or Claire Perry, or maybe Amber Rudd? I don't know. I can go through a bunch of people that are no longer there. Something about the whip. I got to study up on this. I don't know.
Yeah, you get the whip removed from yourself as well. So Matt Hancock got the whip removed for going on I'm a Celebrity, and he's not got it back. But I haven't had the whip removed.
The whip removed. Okay, yeah, I know you're a historian, so what the hell? Whip removed. It just sounds very weird. But we don't have. We carried on a lot of your traditions.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, it's what, you know, you're thinking about the process. It's not too different from providing the structure to make sure everyone marches in line.
No, I understand the concept. We still, in Canada, they do like you marching in line if you're with a party. We just don't have the whip thing. But I mean, it's interesting because it is hard sometimes, right? Because the politics and what needs to be done sometimes clash.
Yeah.
And if you're in a party, sometimes, you know, you're being told you got to do things, and, you know, that's the good thing about being out of politics, is everyone's said unleashed. I mean, I think I was probably within the party and within certainly cabinet. I think no one thought that I didn't speak up. But the reality is, I mean, you are part of a team, and, you know, you got to focus on the end game. But so, I mean, it's interesting, like, what's the best business case? So for folks like are wondering, they're like, oh, NASDAQ are such a drag. Like, what do you say to people who are like, well, I'm not really sure. Yeah, we should do this. I mean, you can talk about risk, obviously risk, and everyone has to remember how much we are paying right now. Everyone is paying, in particular, if you live in, say, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, or places, or, you know, the Horn of Africa right now, massive drought. But I mean, everyone's paying the price. In Canada, we had a town, Lytton, BC, which actually literally it had a what did we call it, like a heat dome over it, and it literally incinerated. So that's like, we're a wealthy country, and that's happening. So I mean, there's the risk, but what's the opportunity? Like, what's your soundbite to folks that are like, I don't know about this?
Well, I think that the overarching, you know, principle is, you know, I can't remember which song lyric it comes from. You got to change to say the same, haven't you? And reality is the transition is just like any other transition in history. So the fact, I mean, we've just seen, again, I want to go back to, but we've just lost, Ford have moved their electric vehicle plant, and they're going to move back to America. Why? Because we didn't get our act together and build out a gigafactory. And if you don't take those actions in time, then you find you are following, and there's no prizes for coming second, or silver, gold medal, bronze medal, whatever. But ultimately,
we lose jobs. So I mean, second place is losing jobs and economic growth.
And we lost out to the Danes in offshore wind in the UK. We lost out to the French in nuclear. There's been so many historic examples where the UK has led and then just up sticks and not made the follow-through investment, which has been catastrophic for building out future workforces. When you look at electricity, we could have led there in the late 19th century. There are 14 different types of plugs around the world. There's just one example historically of the transition, because if you look at it, why have we got 240 volts running through our plugs? It's because America decided to then take the advantage and electrify before the UK. The cost of copper went up, and we had to put the enhanced voltage through the plugs to basically cope with the less copper.
I did not know that. That's why it's so weird, and I have to go find that other plug every time I go to a hotel. I'm like, damn it, I didn't bring it. But okay.
But that's the risk.
Well, let's talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, because Canada. One of our, Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister's father, said it's like sleeping. It's like sleeping with an elephant. I think. I may have gotten that wrong, but I mean, look, they are all in. They have a very hard time regulating, and everything gets litigated. But they are investing bazillion dollars, both through the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So, I mean, certainly in Canada, I think everyone's staying tuned for our budget. It's going to come out at the end of this month, and we're going to see, okay, what's the reaction? Are we actually having an green industrial strategy to compete with the US? Now, we have a price on pollution, and we have other pieces that create the right incentives for innovation and to really incent the private sector. But I mean, look, they're going to attract a lot of investment and be able to scale. But what's the view in the UK looking at what the US is doing now?
Well, I think it's a bit of a split picture, to be honest. There's been a couple of ministers who's come out and said, oh, the Inflation Reduction Act is going to break World Trade Organization rules, is protectionism. But the reality is, with that sort of argument, you can't sort of like just walk away from $369 billion worth of investment. And by the time it goes through the WTO, if it does at all, that money will be gone and we'll have missed out. So I think sort of there are others who are thinking, well, where can the UK sort of fit in with this? We can't match that level of investment, but maybe there are, international opportunities for us to look at where we can, find comparative advantage. And I'm genuinely nervous, if I'm honest with you. I'm not even in government now, but I feel like sort of like that. There are 2 weeks, I think, to save Britain's climate leadership. And I don't say that lightly. But basically, the government's going to respond to the net zero review. It's going to, come back and they've said this is coming end of the month. And if they don't if they take a knife to a gunfight, and produce, what are they going to put on the table? Because, the EU, I think, are responding imminently with their own sort of Inflation Reduction Act response. So if it's set up now, and if the UK can't deliver a response that matches the ambition of both the US and the EU, that money's, that investment is quickly going to dissipate. Any sort of, companies who are thinking about locating here, any investment funds that are thinking of funding companies that are already here, are already being sort of having their heads turned by the 45Q tax credit, but also that sense of stability and certainty, continuity and clarity, the 4 C's that I set out in the Mission Zero mission, which is like, just tell us what we're doing, tell us the program, set out a 10-year roadmap of delivery. And that's where, the UK has had sort of project by project recently, and we've just got to step up if we want to salvage, what's left in this, limited time that we have.
So I was here yesterday, I was in Parliament, and there was like the budget, so the red book, and I don't understand. So, in 2 weeks they're going to step up, but normally if there are investments, would they have been announced in the budget? And what's your view of the budget in terms of what you have called for?
So I think it's been difficult for Jeremy Hunt. Obviously, he's had sort of take over and create a sort of stabilization process and demonstrate that he's got his hand on the tiller. And obviously, the challenges, same in Canada, the economic shocks of COVID and elsewhere. I mean, that obviously, taxation now is running high as a percentage of GDP to cover a number of these overheads.
You guys also shocked your own economy, if I remember one budget.
Yes, yeah, and
not to bring up probably difficult things.
No, but the challenge is making sure, and things are sort of correcting themselves, but what is the investable, where is the money going to be put for climate technology specifically? And that's a question that the budget didn't properly answer, because obviously it covered like £20 billion for CCUS, had a bit on nuclear, nothing else. I think they're saving it all up for this.
So they might do off budget, like they might do other announcements, or you're expecting, because they need to, you're going to be marking them. So and I think you are going to be waiting to see, are they actually stepping up to do what they said they do?
But the challenge is going to be, obviously, that money's not, now the budget's been set for this year, or at least for this, up until the autumn, then there's no potentially new money for the next 6 months. It's what, it might be they'll say, well, we're going to set out now this long-term projection and make available money. And that would be great to have that certainty. I just completed a piece of work on green regulation and where can we find regulatory opportunities to enhance inward investment for the future. But revenue neutral carbon price. Follow Canada's example. Well, give them money back. You create the incentive for business, for people to choose different options, but you're giving the money back to people, so more people are better off, actually, in Canada's case. Just free advice on the policy side. Yeah, I mean, I think the carbon price question is a really important issue, and obviously reflects back into your report around the opportunity of the voluntary carbon market and where you create proper integrity. But you can't really have proper integrity if there's like different sort of price mechanisms. You can still go on websites and find someone offering you a $30 a ton of CO2 versus how is the one that actually is correct. Well, so in Canada's case, it was everyone that made money on marijuana when we legalized it, or suddenly they're like, hey, I got an idea for you. I was like, okay, please, can you not call me? Because it's a free for all. Everyone's like, I know a farmer and some land and some like credit thingy. And well, so I guess that'll be the test with this report. I mean, in Canada, we have our budget coming out, and I think the real test is do people believe it?
right? Like you can't do climate and have it kind of like an adjunct anymore. That's over. In a way, I almost think you should get rid of the minister responsible for climate. Maybe the minister for net zero makes sense, but the reality, everyone has to own it, and especially finance. And like, you have to believe it. Like you actually have to believe that this is a huge economic opportunity, because it'll drive behavioral change. If you're just doing like, oh, a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there, and then we're going to keep on investing, subsidizing oil and gas companies, and, it's not going to work. It's obviously that has to really believe, you have to believe, one, it's a huge risk to your economy if you're not focused on this and making the right investments, and it's a huge opportunity, and you could lose this race, in our case and yours, to the United States and others who are really focused on it. You know what? I think we're just as exciting as Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. Don't you think? Like the rest is politics. Like, they've got to watch it. We've got a real podcast or something in our future, because we're like straight talkers. I'm kind of more on the progressive left, and you're kind of more like, I don't know how you want to describe yourself, but like centrist, but you got your blue tie on. So like, I guess still a conservative.
I don't know. I mean, I think the thing is when I first came into politics, I mean, I know you joined politics, I think sort of with this as your passion already. I sort of joined, and I came to it late. I did some work on, looking at nature and protecting the green belt and sort of countryside in my local area. But you'd asked me back in 2019 that this thing called net zero would have gone viral, and that we will be where we are now, I simply wouldn't have believed you. But
do you know, I didn't know what a COP was. So when I started, I had to go to the COP, and I had to. So that was in 2015, and I literally got elected. I was named to cabinet, and the prime minister was like, "Good news, you're going to the COP." And I was like, "The COP." Now, it's not that I didn't know what the COP was, i.e., it was climate, people and people getting together. But I was like, what the hell does the COP stand for? And then someone told me, I asked my public servants, I was like, no stupid questions, right? So then I said, what's a COP? And then they said a conference of parties. And I was like, okay, that is not descriptive, and no more acronyms. So I had worked on human rights. I had done antitrust and trade law. And I cared about climate, but there were people who were experts. Like they had devoted, my friends who had devoted their life. So I actually came to, I knew about climate and I cared about climate change, but I was no expert. And I quickly realized, could everyone start talking like a normal person and like about things people care about? Because just talking about even net zero, I guess people are kind of getting with the program of net zero, but still, it's not very accessible language. Net zero, COPs, even when you talk about mitigation or you talk about like a whole range of things, people are like, I have no idea what anyone's talking about. And that doesn't foster confidence, and it doesn't, get, people to be like, I'm all in. So, but it's amazing because you can learn this. Clearly you did your report.
Yeah.
And hopefully all the people that are watching or listening, and they all know about all the climate terms. They're all hardcore, all in.
But it is that element of a narrative and communication that's so key to get cut through, because people sort of say, oh, net zero is not going to win elections, but I would refute that. Once you break it down and sort of say, well, actually, this is going to make you warmer and richer. I know it's like in Canada, energy efficiency, but we are the poor man in Europe. We have not invested, and we have got crap housing, really crap housing. With bad insulation.
Let's say in Canada, we could have net zero houses. But we don't even have the building code to be net zero. It's set at the federal level. It's voluntary, and the provinces implement it. But I was like, and they were like, we're working on it. I was like, I don't know, go take it from somewhere else. Like, what are we doing? So I think there is low-hanging fruit for all of us to do.
Yeah, I think it's that question of like, what's the world you want to live in? And actually, when you look at the transition, actually all you're doing, this is also to sort of, take net zero and not say it's a radical revolution, scare people. People's boilers are going to need replacing. Let's not replace light with light. Let's just replace them with a heat pump. Let's totally. Replace someone's car. People get through their cars every 7 years or whatever. So you're just going to a different. Just in the same way we replaced our TVs with flat screen TVs, or we threw out our DVD collection and went for Netflix. This isn't necessarily a scary, costly transition. It doesn't need to be, as long as we can provide the certainty. And that's the thing also. Trying to get that across. I guess it's that challenge of how do you demonstrate how important this is for the future of the world, and making sure that we show the stewardship that we want to keep the planet alive, but at the same time not scaring people to death and thinking actually, they can't do anything because we can do something, but then also actually the measures that are needed to be taken forward that we can actually do now, today, as you say, rather than wait for the technology of tomorrow, should happen anyway if we wish to make that choice.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because I think we have to just be aware that regular people are busy. They're trying to get through their day. They care about climate change. As you say, there are very few that don't believe in climate change at all, sometimes on my Twitter feed, by the way. It's about saving money. It's about being more efficient. It's about good jobs. It's about a growing economy. Of course, it's also about managing risk, and we're all paying the price for climate change right now. But I do think it's really, really, really important, and I emphasize to everyone how you talk about it. Like, don't talk about how you want to talk about it. How are people going to hear, regular people who want to act? How do we, get them excited about this opportunity? How do we get them to think it's not a threat to their life? Climate change is, but, their way of life. And really, get people to enable them to make choices. And that's government's role in terms of, electric vehicles. We've seen you need some incentives now. The price is going down. And who could have imagined that we would have so many choices in electric vehicle, and we're getting rid of the internal combustion engine. I mean, that's incredible. But as you say, I mean, you have to think about where are people at. And when you design policy, I've always said, policy, you need good policy, but good policy also thinks about people, which gets back to carbon pricing. As I say, we gave the money back to people, so more people were better off, and it was a progressive policy. Because if you didn't have a lot of money, you probably were relying on public transit. You didn't have a massive house, you didn't have multiple houses and multiple cars. So I think that is something that government sometimes forgets. That you can't talk down to people. You have to just, enable action, but also talk about what people care about. And I think that jobs, obviously, is critically important. The cost of living, critically important. I think there's really a lot of opportunity in that regard. So is the politics possible? So sometimes people say the politics makes it impossible. Like, what do you think? Is it too hard to make the case? Is that why, for example, in Canada, I'll be the first to say, the government continues to subsidize the oil sands, which is hugely polluting, and they're actually making massive profits only as a result of a legal war. And then they're giving that money to their, they're doing share buybacks and executive compensation. People are paying more for their fuels, and then the fossil fuel companies are demanding subsidies. And then the government, I hope they don't do it again, but have done it. I'm like, are we suckers? Why are we doing this? And it's, for some reason, there seems to be a disconnect on politics, where in this one, I think you can just say no corporate welfare. That's a conservative idea. That should be a, progressive idea. But what's the deal? Why do all governments get tripped up?
So I guess the challenge is that you do have this sort of wave of reform, I guess. To what extent, I voted against fracking. I don't see any future for fracking, but the previous generation of energy ministers to me saw sort of fracking potentially as an energy mix and gas. And I think there is a ratchet sort of happening. And you've seen this with Biden. If Biden hadn't done the Inflation Reduction Act, would he be under so much pressure with this sort of Alaskan oil field decision? That this seems quite similar to the reaction that we're now getting in the UK about this nuts idea about having a new coal mine in Cumbria in the north of England. Sort of once you begin to say, it's all about, as you say, integrity matters on the front of your report, and people are now calling out the bullshitters. I think when it comes to basically those who say this is what you want and this is therefore you can't simply square the circle with this. It'd be interesting to see where we go with future investment in oil and gas, because I saw BlackRock today sort of said, they're still committing to future investments, but surely this is going to be the last sort of castle to fall eventually, and it's not simply going to be possible. And as you say, people are beginning to now vote with their feet when it comes to elections. So I think if you look in Australia, the Conservative Party got sort of taken out of power by the Teal independents. And I think the election in 2024 in the UK, climate will be an issue. and it will be an issue in the red wall, the so-called seats that the Conservatives won off Labour, because people there recognise an opportunity when they see one, and they want those deindustrialised estates turned into, the companies, the industries of the future. And they recognise that the future, of steel is not like opening a coking coal plant. It's making the UK a leader in green steel. So I honestly feel sometimes politicians.
We want to beat you on that. See, it's competition. Okay. See, this is a competition. I'm from Hamilton, which is the steel town. So we want to have the greenest steel. This is as a Conservative, I believe that competition brings forward results, totally. And this is where in this net zero race that we've entered, there are, as I said, no prizes are coming second. And that's the risk we face if we don't take action now. I can see Elizabeth join the. I know that call. Means that it's time to get questions from the audience. All right.
It does. I could have just happily sat here listening to you, but there's also some awesome questions. There's a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask you to keep the answers relatively short so we can at least hear the questions, even if we don't get comprehensive answers. But I like the fact we were just getting into being competitive, Catherine. It reminded me that you were saying that you were a competitive swimmer beforehand. So we've looped back to competition. I'm going to ask read out the first question from Isha Karg, because it touches on what you were talking about just beforehand. But I'm gonna, Isha, if you don't mind, I'm gonna read your question. I'm gonna add something to it. Because Isha says, do you think that the USA will be able to achieve their net zero targets of 2050 after the approval of the Willow project? And this is the approval of the drilling for oil in Alaska. But I want to loop that back to something you mentioned, Catherine, which is this idea that if we have transparency and companies sort of, tell us what their net zero ambitions are, then shareholders and investors and, the general public can make choices. But it seems like here, are we being driven by the choices of people who just want to make their short-run profits from drilling in an approach that's not consistent with net zero and doesn't fit with your sort of red line of no new fossil infrastructure?
Well, I mean, it doesn't fit in with the red line of no new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is really on the proponent as well as on the government. Now, look, this is where I got to the politics, right? I mean, let's be clear that I think a lot of folks, I know some of the indigenous peoples in Alaska were totally opposed. But some people really wanted it. And this is where I think this is why it gets hard for governments. But governments have to be a little more clear-headed about it, because so I see this in Canada. There's a confusion that fossil fuel companies' interest is the same interest as regular people because they talk about jobs. So just to be 100% clear, the interests of fossil fuel companies are, one, to make as much money as possible, two, to continue their life as long as possible, three, to pay as little as possible for the pollution they cause, which is not the same as what regular people want. Regular people want jobs. They want jobs. That is like a real thing. And a government that doesn't think about jobs has a real problem. But they want good jobs, but they also want climate action, and they want economic growth, and they want investment in infrastructure in their communities. Those are not the same things, but sometimes it gets confused. So then governments are like, okay, I really care about climate, but now I've got a lot of pressure here, so we're going to do that. So, but the challenge with that is that this can go on forever. We say we care about climate change, but everyone has to be held accountable. And I mean, the irony of that project, like I'm reading about it, and they're literally talking, I think it's ConocoPhillips, they're literally talking about the need to have chillers, because climate change is actually meaning that that it's being built in an area where, it's literally melting. So they have to have chillers. I was like, this is where we are losing the plot, folks. We have to stop doing this, because the folks that are actually causing climate change, and we should be very clear, like sometimes I think everyone's like, we just planted trees or electric vehicles. All these things are important, retrofit buildings. But the reality is that 80% of GHGs, close to 80% of GHGs, and 90% of CO2 comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So I think we just have to be a little bit disciplined. But this is the challenge with government, right? Like when you're in government, you're not always going to make the right choices. In business, you often will be focused on the short term, although now you should be focused on risk in the short term and opportunity in the short term, and you have a fiduciary obligation. But what we need is an ambition loop. so that you have business saying, we have to do more, government, we need these climate policies, and not lobby against good climate policies. And then we need government creating an enabling environment, sometimes regulating, sometimes creating, financial incentives to actually get us going in the right direction. Because by the way, we're never going to get there if we continue doing this where we're doing a little bit here, but then we're going backwards here. Like, it doesn't work. The science isn't, literally, it's funny on climate, like when I'm out of government now, I'm like, oh my God, that was really weird, because it's as if you're negotiating with the science. Science doesn't care. They don't care about your politics. They don't care. The science is the science. And we are nowhere. Well, I mean, we've made progress, so I don't want to downplay the progress. But if everyone implements everything we, committed to, I think we're at 2.4 degrees of warming. Now, 2.4 degrees of warming is catastrophic. There's going to be catastrophic change, especially for the most, the poorest people in the world, but it's going to be catastrophic for everyone. And we can actually do this. And this goes back to, I am competitive. You know what? We got a stretch goal. Every day we should work really hard, and we try to not say, oh, it's really hard, and we whine. Just actually go for it. And sometimes it's going to be really hard. But if you have a long-term goal, you can remain focused. And you can pick yourself up, and then you make progress, and then you feel good, and there are other people hopefully cheering you on. And that's what we need to get into. But I mean, I will say things like that are demoralizing, like Willow. There are things like we're subsidizing the oil sands in Canada, a coal mine in Cumbria. That's what's happening. There are all these things where you're like, okay, on the one hand, you're doing this, but on the other hand, you're doing this, which demonstrates you actually don't necessarily believe this is a huge economic opportunity and the way the world needs to go, because you're doing something that demonstrates the opposite.
Thanks. No, that's great.
And that wasn't short. So I am now going to be more disciplined. I'm still got the politician in me where you're just like, blah, 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 blah.
It was a great answer though, so it was worth spending.
And now poor Chris didn't even get to say a word.
Chris, you're not allowed to answer this question. We will not get to the other one, so you'll have a chance.
That's the next one.
I've got a question from Bernard Casey, or if we're west of the Atlantic, Bernard Casey. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, but he says he wishes to know what and under what conditions pension funds can be contributing to financing a climate transition. He's particularly interested in the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, the Netherlands, where there are substantial funded pensions.
Should I start with this one? I mean, I'm not a huge expert. I've been doing a couple of roundtables on the back of this green regulation work to try to ask investors, what would help unlock some of their investment. It was I didn't frame this myself. It was I was given this task as a co-chair. But I've noticed sort of from some of the responses that there seems to be a shift that actually pension firms, patient capital is not this year seeking to invest as much as they had done previously in climate sort of technologies, which is slightly sort of worrying. And it points to potentially the barriers being around actually the level of which is seen as an accepted investment. So actually some of these pension companies aren't going to invest in a project unless it's 40 million quid, maybe 20 million pounds at the lowest, where that in itself is not necessarily what's needed for some of these climate startups. So there's this sort of gulf. And we've got to be able to work out a way in which pension companies potentially can look and say, you know what, we're going to take a pooled group of companies, maybe by sector or maybe by region. I think there's some really interesting examples of investments that could happen in cities or in clusters where potentially let's create sort of investment fund propositions that pool a larger number of green technology startups or companies. And let the pension funds then say, right, okay, we recognize this is an amount we can now release. But that seems to me like the number one barrier that I've sort of picked up is that they're not willing to make some of the small scale, high risk investments. And it's how you spread the risk at the same time. Well, I think you spread the risk at the same time as having a portfolio, but they need the portfolio created for them, it seems.
So, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, they're going to have to, it was easy when you could just do a massive project that was like a bridge or fossil fuel infrastructure, whereas these projects are often smaller scale. But I think pooling is going to be really important. But it's a huge opportunity because, the pension funds, like a lot of them is, so in Canada, teachers care about climate action. So in the good news, they're actually pushing the folks that are investing their money, because by the way, doesn't belong to the pension fund. It's employees' money, right? It's the, you should have a say on what's happening. And this is what I think is really important. It's these empowering people. Of course, we always say to people, turn off the light, use a water bottle, buy an electric vehicle. But we also need to scale. And by scale, that's like big money that we need. And it has to stop funding dirty. It has to move to clean. And I think pension funds, there's a real opportunity because that's someone else's money and you get to say where your money goes. So I've actually spent a lot of time talking to Canadian pension funds and trying to understand this. Of course, it depends who's, whose money you're investing. But, public servants, teachers, often, if you ask them, they'll say, yeah, we don't want it to be funding new fossil fuel infrastructure. So I think that's really the opportunity. But once again, it's everyone having the disclosure, right? Like people need to know what is happening. And sometimes it's extremely hard to know. Like you've got an ESG fund. Where is it even going? And so the public is trying to figure this out. So radical transparency in this, where you can actually vote with your dollars, I think is super important.
Thanks. Yeah, I think can't disagree. We've got two slightly related questions from two students, so I'm going to put those two together. The first is from Tushar Aneja, a fourth-year politics student at the University of Edinburgh. You had two questions, so I'm just going to ask one of them. And you said, what are some of the ways in which governments around the world can more effectively resist pressure from fossil fuel lobbyists and petrostates? And Tushar is reminding us that in COP27, there were more delegates from the fossil fuel industry than delegates from environmental organizations. And then we have a question, this is from a student, Marie-Denise Bain. She's an LSE student and she's from Montreal, Canada. So a double thumbs up there.
Bonjour.
And her question is, what do you think about the recent Glasgow Climate Pact's commitment to phase down coal-fired power station rather than phase out, and the importance of that one word? So it's all about the fossil fuels, COP, and the importance of words.
Well, okay, I'll take a stab at this because I have strong views on this. We gotta stop lobbying. And like sometimes people are focused, like, did someone get a free dinner? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about access to ministers, access to senior public servants by fossil fuel companies and others. Like, just why do people who have lots of money get more access? Because let me tell you, like, they will tell you their side of the story. And in a way, it's just human psychology. You hear that and you're like, okay, well, we are not going to go quite as far as they want, but we'll go halfway. I think that's really got to end. And once again, almost all of these companies say they're committed to net zero. So the report is very, very clear. You cannot lobby against climate action. You can't. I mean, you can say this policy, like on carbon pricing, you need to take account this or this. You cannot say, forget it, we don't want to have this policy or that policy. So, I mean, I think that's number one. Number two, I mean, in a way, it's not that hard for government. I find it kind of weird. So whether you're a liberal or a conservative, liberal, I mean like a Canadian liberal, or let's just say a progressive or a conservative, you should believe that it should not be free to pollute and that polluters should pay. Like, I think if I asked most people, they would say, yeah, polluters should pay. Well, then why are we paying to clean up the pollution? Like, why is it that we're privatizing profits and socializing the costs? That doesn't make any sense. And to be honest, the fossil fuel companies are doing a terrible job. Once again, like we actually today in Canada, the Greenpeace, as well as the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, Eco-Justice, and others, have filed a misleading advertising case against the Pathways Alliance of oil sands companies on the basis that they are not net zero aligned. Their emissions are going up. Their money is not going at scale to clean. It's going to dirty. They're lobbying against climate action. And so it's actually easy in a way to say, like, what the heck? You're not even investing your own money, and then you're demanding money from people, because it's not the government's money, by the way. It's taxpayer money. It's like everyone's dollars. I mean, look, I understand the argument that fossil fuel companies, well, they should be energy companies, by the way, and that doesn't mean just oil and gas. That means actually moving to like energy. Energy is whatever kilojoules. Like, it's just actually, it can, we have renewables that have gone down and are cheaper. So I mean, we have to engage with them. but they do need to be called out and held accountable. And that's just life. Like, I don't know, this is the major cause of climate change. I worry about cops. Like in a way, that's not even necessarily where all the action is at. COP21 was really important. So that was in 2015. I was very fortunate, just new minister there. And we got an ambitious agreement with a temperature goal, 1.5 degrees, below 2, striving for 1.5. And that was critically important. We needed to get rules around the Paris Agreement. But now the action needs to happen, like governments need to act, business needs to act, and we need to move forward. I'm not entirely sure that where we're going now with everything focuses on a COP, everyone goes to the COP, a whole agenda is around a COP. Not entirely sure that's what we need. It's not that COPs themselves are terrible, although, I mean, having more oil and gas lobbyists than climate activists is like completely unconscionable. As people have said, you're not going to have you're not going to have a conference, about cancer and invite the tobacco companies. So just saying, but I mean, I think we need to like just be a little more focused on outcomes. And I wonder about, COPs. Are we just spending a lot of time talking as opposed to everyone just every day doing the work?
Chris, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think on the COPs, I mean, it's long overdue, and I know Simon Steele wants to look at reforming the COP process as if he could. I guess the challenge is if we unpick something in this multilateral process, these 40 different negotiation streams. I think I understand. I think I asked someone in Alex's team, like, why did that come? What phasing out became phasing down? They just said, well, it was so late in the day, they basically refused to allow it. Everything else would have collapsed, sort of the whole negotiating. And that's clearly a huge issue around how can you ensure that there can still maintain agreement on everything else? Why does everything come down to that single word, even if there's separate work streams that could have been agreed? Why can't we sort of have a negotiating process that singles out the ability that nothing is either, it's all or nothing? That's clearly a farce. I think that the challenge also with COPs is that we come back to this jamboree every single year. There's actually a sort of project now to create an alternative re-COP, I see, that sort of is being created by Chad Frischman, and they want to set something up, because partly through the issue around fossil fuel lobbying. And the challenge to me is how do and I see Guterres wants to set up this high ambition meeting outside of the COP, which in itself was like, well, if he's thinking that, then surely that it's overdue for COPs to be, looked at and revised. But taking forward the net zero view, it's also fantastic examples of best practice. Whether that was local engagement in cities, community energy projects, industrial decarbonisation, startups that are demonstrating how we can use nature-based solutions. Why can't we be a bit more positive and say, well, every year a country, rather than coming back and saying what they have or haven't done, why don't they come with solutions each year and actually say, look, everyone, this is what we've got. And the COPs I've been to, it's been far more engaging on the margins, where people have come together and showed positive examples. And I think we need to have that sense of and also I think there's this sense of I think ever since Copenhagen, a sort of sense that these things are now too big to fail. And that in itself creates this stifling of innovation, because you do need to take risks sometimes. And I think Paris took a risk on 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees, and that led to net zero on the back of the IPCC 2018 report. And so I think we've got to find a way in which people aren't going to sort of gum up and sort of like think that they can't sort of progress beyond the sort of structures of Paris. The real challenge, Paris is such a breakthrough, but it potentially becomes a prison if we look now at what's happening, and if climate the warming scenarios continue to accelerate in the way they are, we're going to have to take further action, and it needs to be multilateral action. If that's going to mean that we're going to be able to tackle some of the challenges that we seem to be facing. It's a different world to 2015, and I think we also need to understand that as well.
Thanks. Yeah. There's always difficult to talk about COPs. They're sort of essential, but they're so frustrating. Maybe they're not essential anymore. So there's a few questions about greenwashing. So what I'm going to do is read a few questions and comments for you guys. I don't expect answers to all of them, but I think it's actually really nice for us to hear the sort of comments and questions that are coming. So there's a question specifically to you, Catherine, from John Holland in Glasgow University. John is saying, could you imagine constructing a greenwash index based on the tell elements of your colleagues' ideas of net zero? And would this actually be sounder than the current ESG ratings? And I just want to then just add a few comments from people that are quite interesting. Shashank Nigam, who's a former member of your ward in Ottawa Centre, brings up the point you made quite early on, actually, about EasyJet stopping its offsetting, but saying, look, there's barely any sustainable aircraft fuel in their aircraft. There's no hydrogen or electric craft that are flying. So isn't offsetting in the meantime the correct option? And then there's just a couple of, I just want to find these questions. I've scribbled down whose names I'm looking for. And then Mark Falcon says, well, what about government greenwashing? So should we be calling EVs zero emissions, given that they have embodied carbon? Sometimes people are using non-green electricity. And of course, there's particulate pollution from, I'm adding this, tires and brakes. So Mark, I was just adding, I assume that's the particulate pollution you're talking about. And then just one other comment from Tim, who says, what would it take for Canada to drastically cut its oil sands output? So this is a highly polluting industry in Canada. So I think the question is about, do we need a greenwashing index? But there was just quite a lot of people really.
There's a lot there. So, okay.
There is.
So look, I'm not an ESG expert, but I feel like now kind of an expert on net zero. The good news is it's measurable in a easy to understand way. It may be hard to do. And people may groan and say, well, why did you say no new fossil fuel infrastructure, for example? But it's actually measurable. And that's what's very good about this, because climate is the thing. I mean, of course, other things are the thing. And underlying climate is inequality or, fostering equality or making investments, to ensure that everyone's succeeding. But your emissions need to go down right now. And you need to invest at scale and clean. So in a way you can do that. So I think, it's easier to measure in a very transparent way. That's work is going on to do that. So I think that's helpful because, and what our report really was intended to do. So as I said, in Canada right now, there's a case that's been a filing that's been made with the Competition Bureau saying that the Pathways Alliance they're greenwashing. And it's because their emissions are going up. They're not going down. The money is not being invested in clean. The focus is on new fossil fuel infrastructure, lobbying against climate action, not covering all the emissions, just emissions intensity, and no skip there. So, okay, so that's good because you can actually say in an objective way, this is what's required. So I think it is hopefully helpful. That's part of the report. I was like, let's be practical here, because that will also help good business because everyone's not greenwashing. Some people are actually working really hard and it's hard. Okay, so let's take areas. So hard to decarbonize sectors. By the way, that's not oil and gas. I want to be 100% clear about that. That's not a hard to decarbonize sector. We have renewables. But if you're talking about cement, steel, aluminum, aviation, those are hard to decarbonize. But now I'm going to sound really nerdy, but I think this is important. We need everyone to have a net zero pathway. So that doesn't mean you're going to immediately be net zero, but you've got a pathway for your sector about what you can do. So say you're in a hard to decarbonize sector, you still need to do what you can do now, right? You shouldn't be able to buy credits for that piece because we want you to do that. We want you to scale innovation and help other industries. We did say in our report, assuming credits with integrity, which is hard, and other people are working on that, we can solve absolutely everything with this report, that you should do more. You should compensate for those emissions that you cannot reduce now. So I don't know, that's a bit nerdy. Go read the report if you don't understand that. Sometimes it's hard to explain these in sound bites. Government greenwashing, 100%. Although we talked about different things, there was something about EVs. I hear this sometimes. I hear wind farms are killing birds and nuclear is, there's problems with it. And by the way, it is very expensive and bearing waste is very hard, but it is zero emitting. So there's government greenwashing, 100%, that needs to be called out. But we also have to be quite realistic about what we're doing. We can't say everything is terrible, especially if it's reducing emissions. My view, and I get that is people have issues with nuclear, including environmentalists, and those are real issues. But we have to separate emissions coming down back to my emissions need to come down. In Germany, they were taking nuclear offline and doing the dirtiest coal. Like that is not that. I mean, it depends what you're trying to measure, but I mean, I think if you're trying to tackle climate change, we have to be slightly careful that, we're not saying, well, EVs, there are problems because of the, like, we do have some solutions. Are they perfect? No, but it's like all hands on deck now. And some people might not like it. I just say, call it as I see it. And then oil sands output. Look, oil sands have said, and oil and gas companies, they've committed to net zero. So let's just take it on face value that they mean that. They may not understand it, so they need to be reminded. They can't mislead people. They have to do things. So if they can reduce their emissions on a 1.5 degree pathway, go fill your boots. And so that's why the government of Canada has said that they're not talking about reducing output. They're having a cap on emissions. So honestly, the oil sands should be amazing. That's what they've said. They said that they want their emissions to go down. Great. So you should innovate and figure out how you're going to reduce your emissions in line with 1.5 degrees. And so they should actually be pushing for a cap because it's going to create the incentive for them to reduce emissions. Is that hard? Yes, but hard things are hard. And if you're going to say you're going to be committed to net zero, you need to do that. Whether or not that's going to happen or that is the oil sands are going to do that, totally different story. But by the way, people are going to become dinosaurs. Remember VHS tapes? Or actually, I used to do like little mixtapes. That's how old I am. Like I'd listen to the radio and I'd be like, that song I love makes me think of this boy or whatever. So I taped it. Yeah, you know what? I don't use tapes anymore. I don't even know where my tapes are. I was trying to find a tape. And every time I'd use a tape, it would come out and then you'd be like with a pencil. That is what's going to happen to folks that do not innovate. They're going to go like the dinosaurs. They're going to become extinct. Maybe not fast enough. That's why we have to make sure that we're doing this. But you either get with the program or you get out. And honestly, like free advice, if I'm a fossil fuel company, I'm an energy company. I move into the space. We didn't get out of the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We got smarter. So yeah, let's all get smarter and actually tackle climate change. So I don't know. There was a lot of questions there. So who knows?
I wish all the oil and gas.
Sometimes. So that means like maybe I did an okay job. But Chris, what do you want to add, Chris?
No, I mean, you've seen it, like, companies like Ørsted gave up their fossil fuel past to set up in the wind farms and they've never looked back. So, it's been done. I just say from the UK perspective, obviously, we've got the North Sea, big question about how we manage our transition. Even the CCC says we'll still be using 60% of oil and gas come 2050 on a net zero scenario, but the industry themselves won't accept the balanced pathway. So there's a tension. And they're not doing enough. They say they'll have 50% production emissions reduction. The CCC say it must be 68% by 2030. So there is that gulf. And the net zero review sort of recognises that they've got to go further. Banning flaring. Norway's had a flaring ban in place since 1972. Why can't we do the same in the UK? Particularly what we now know about methane, a way we didn't know, say, 5 years ago. And as you say, the producer should pay. And it's a responsibility of government. We've got this windfall tax that's now gone on oil and gas companies on the basis of their profits. But they're still allowing the capital allowances to be basically writing off some of that tax against refurbishing the rigs. And we've got to be able to look at how the taxation system either works for or against the transition. If we're serious as a government about tackling net zero, and for me, understanding that we look at where we could be, if all these companies, BP, Shell, I don't know, they want to be net zero companies. Obviously, there's an inherent tension in that, but nevertheless, they shouldn't mind being taxed. But why shouldn't that tax be hypothecated and put in a net zero fund that could not only help sort of fund abatement, but critically could then pay for net zero projects, in the UK, could cover energy efficiency, and that's where the government's not been willing to move. But I just feel, we are not, setting the frameworks. We're allowing, that investment to continue to flow without thinking about the conditionality. And the French place condition, and this is what Mariana Mazzucato, I think, sort of has focused on really effectively. Aviation wasn't allowed to continue in COVID. It received the bailouts, but on the condition that it set itself a greening pathway. And we need to be bolder in being innovative in our policy making, just as if we're being innovative in our technology making.
100% agree with that.
It's quite frustrating, isn't it? Because it's not rocket science. I mean, both of you, Catherine and Chris, have laid out very sensible policies. They're not hard to implement. Some are revenue neutral, so they're not costly. And yet still the emissions are going in the wrong direction. There's at least 3 questions, because questions seem to be coming in all the time. But quite reasonably, we've been focusing on high-income countries because that's where the majority of the emissions are, and that's where the responsibility lies. But there's at least 3 questions that do link to low and middle-income countries. So again, I'll just give you all questions, and then you can pick and choose. Philippa Parker, student from Cumbria, has said, is the expectation of net zero different for countries that are still developing? And then we have Virginia Julie, a PhD student from the University of Reading. I used to work at Reading, so welcome, Virginia. Saying sort of, with the mind on temperature records being broken on a global scale, whether an acceleration of the rate of decarbonisation is possible for low and middle income countries as much as the rich ones. And Peter Splinter, you had a question. Dang, I might be scrolling the wrong way. I'm trying to cluster these, but if you just give me 5 more seconds. Peter has a question. Yes, again, parallel set of challenges for development in large parts of the global south. How do we create space for financial and technical assistance for low and middle income countries for both climate action and development? So shifting the focus onto low and middle income countries.
So I think this is really important. And if you read our report, once again, only 10 recommendations, so go to it, go read it. Number 9, I believe, was the focus on the money that's required to go to less developed countries. Because the reality is 1 trillion for the energy transition, or 3 trillion if you're going to meet the SDGs. So that's a lot of money. And you can't say to less developed countries, I'm sorry, you can't have the same quality of life. You can't, turn on the lights because we've decided we're getting off fossil fuels, and we've been polluting. Rich countries have been doing a ton of pollution, but sorry, you're out of luck. So that money needs to flow. Part of that is, we now have a new head of the World Bank who's not, denying climate change. So that's always a positive thing. Hopefully he will focus on scaling money from the private sector too. There is a limit. We need governments for sure to step up. I think we invested $2.65 billion Canada when I came in as minister, and we announced a COP, but that's a drop in the bucket in terms of amount of money we need. So we definitely need developed countries to step up. We have been able to benefit because we polluted, and we have been the large contributor to climate change. And it's interesting in Canada because people are like, Canada's emissions really small. So that's what we often get on the scale of climate denial often. And the reality is Canada is top 10 now. Per capita, we're very high, and historically, we're very high too. So the reality is we need to be contributing. I also think so in terms of net zero, it is true, it's global net zero. Now, I don't want to go down this whole path on differentiation, but the reality is that developed countries should be moving a lot faster than less developed countries. China aside, China needs to do more work. In some ways it's doing good things, but it also needs to be part of that solution right now. But we all need to be doing things, because the reality is if we suddenly everyone develops in the way developed countries have developed, we're screwed. That's that. And so we all need to be focused on how do we help each other. And by the way, the Paris Agreement is so important because it's the first time, and I want to take 1 second to recognize how important the Paris Agreement was, because people can be like, everything sucks and we haven't done anything in climate, whatever. Actually, the Paris Agreement is critically important because the first time ever the whole world came together, not only with a temperature target, with a really clear goal, but everyone said they had to do their part. So I think that's what we all need to remember. It doesn't matter where the pollution is, we're all going to pay the price. And so we need to be helping each other. And less developed countries absolutely need way more help. We need to do technology transfer. We should be working with them. We're trying with jet Ps. Getting countries off coal, it's tricky. But we need to be just focused on getting emissions down, and also, on resilience, on adaptation. Because we're all going to have to adapt, and those that are most impacted are the least able to adapt to the impacts of climate change.
Chris, a couple more minutes, comments?
Yeah, I would say that when it comes to looking at those developing nations, those in the global south, trying to demonstrate the get away from the narrative of these are obviously historic emissions. There are going to be sort of loss and damage funds in place. Recognize the difficult sort of politics of this, but there is an opportunity if we work carefully with these countries, and there's a number of these just energy transition partnerships that are in place, South Africa, Vietnam, India. If we can demonstrate how they can enter the world stage afresh, having sort of been leaders, Namibia is keen to look at how to utilize sort of green hydrogen and sort of the wind opportunities that they sort of have, as well as solar. That positive narrative is really important. And then I think also industrial decarbonisation in the global south. I see on Twitter sometimes people go, oh yeah, that acid rain stuff that didn't turn out to be true, and they just totally oblivious of the facts. Obviously the global north regulated and solved the issue of sulfur dioxide in global emissions, but they just pushed it down south. And actually tackling the climate crisis and reducing emissions also has like co-benefits of reducing industrial pollution, which saves lives. And we shouldn't forget the fact that actually, yes, it's a CO2 challenge, but there's so much also that can come with it. At the same time as reducing CO2 and emissions, we can take all the nasties also out and make sure that people have the ability to lead safe and healthy lives in a way that they're not at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do need to do that. So Mariana Mazzucato, I was just with her yesterday, and we were talking about this. I mean, every dollar should be spent to get multiple outcomes. Of course, climate action, but it should create jobs and growth, and it should tackle inequality. And that's within your own country, but also globally. And that's how we need to be thoughtful about how we do things, and not just say, sorry, you can't do it. Like, you're not going to grow. You're not going to get, be able to turn your lights on. We should be figuring out, how do we scale distributed solar like immediately? Because, by the way, I often hear, well, oil and gas, we have to be careful because oil and gas companies, they're going to bring, these communities. I was like, no oil and gas company I've ever met is saying, wow, this poor community in Africa, I'd really like to go and get them on the grid. So the good news is we actually have other non-polluting solutions, but we need to be focused on, they need the same opportunities. It's not fair. And that is something that is on all of us, but we can do a lot better because we got out of the stone, didn't get out of the Stone Age because we ran on raw stones. We got smarter. So we have new solutions, which, by the way, are cheaper. So the good news is the economics are catching up, but sometimes governments don't care about things being cheaper, which is really weird because they should. So we continue doing the same old because it's a status quo, because they're big interests, and we got to fight that. We just have to actually, I think Chris and I, we're not exactly politically aligned, but I think we're aligned on being practical and being mindful of taxpayer dollars and on being ambitious on climate. And you can do all of that.
Wow, that's a great way to end. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to close the event.
Oh, no.
Sorry. Yep. But I'd just like to say, I think we've ended on such a positive note, reminding ourselves that there are tremendous co-benefits from climate change mitigation, especially for health, especially for quality. And if we see, actually, it's a very positive and exciting pathway forward if we embrace net zero. And as you mentioned, the transition phase is tricky and it has to be managed well, but I think hopefully we leave this, one, it's been a great evening, so thank you, and two, with a sense of positivity. So I encourage everyone to read the 10 points. Can I just thank, before people disappear, can I just thank so much the events team and our colleagues who have been helping behind the scenes. So our GRI colleague Alison Peacock, who is here with us now, but you might not see her, our LSE colleague Nick, I can't see where you are, Nick, but thank you so much also for being a part of this. Bob Ward's behind the scene there, Nicholas Berg, so thank you so much. But obviously, most thanks to this absolutely wonderful conversation between Honourable Catherine McKenna, to be formal, and Right Honourable Chris Skidmore. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Chris. I've had a tremendous evening. I'm sure everyone has too. I'm sorry we couldn't put all the questions to Catherine and Chris, but they were great questions. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating. And I think with that, we can officially close the evening. And once again, thank you to everyone participating, LSE events, colleagues who've made this work, and Catherine and Chris for giving up your.
Thank you.
Thank you.